Okay, today we're talking about Othello, the first part of Othello through Act 2. So, our theme for today's lecture is going to be Shakespeare and racism. First, a brief textual note. There are two distinct versions of Othello. Interestingly, it was never published in Shakespeare's lifetime, but there was a quarto version that was published in, I should have looked up the date, like 1621 or 22, I think. It may have been 1619. Anyway, after Shakespeare's death, there was a quarto version that was published. And then a few years later, in the folio, another version was published. And there are about 400 to 500 lines worth of difference between the quarto and the folio version. There's some interesting speeches, word changes, things like that between the two editions. I believe your Norton version has us reading the folio version. I do believe the folio is slightly more popular, but the quarto is still used quite a bit. So sometimes you'll see the quarto version instead. What I have here is this is the title page of Othello from the folio. And you'll see that it contains the full title, The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. Okay, and if you've read the play, then you've obviously come across that term multiple times by now, Moor. All right, what does that word mean? What does Moor mean? Well, historically, Moor was sort of a general term for Muslim, for any sort of person who was Muslim. So theoretically, there's quite a wide range of peoples, ethnicities, countries that the term Moor can refer to. Everywhere from, the Arabian Peninsula, even over into India. But most of the time, we believe Shakespeare was referring to North African people when he talked about Moors. However, because that term can be so wide-ranging, there's room for interpretation there, right? And so there has been debate and confusion and question about what exact ethnicity Othello is, or how he should be cast, or how he should be portrayed. This confusion is sort of compounded by the confusion around color terminology when applied to skin in Shakespeare's day, which we talked about last week. If you remember in the sonnets, when he refers to his dark lady and talks about how his dark lady has black skin. At the time, really the word black could be applied to white people who just had really dark suntan skin or really swarthy skin. It wasn't firmly along racial lines yet. So there is room. There's room for interpretation and room for confusion, which has led to some debates through history about how to cast Othello. So one line of thinking that, as far as I know, really has only existed in maybe a little bit the 19th century, but the 20th century, there is a strong line of thinking of older scholars that sort of argued that this play is not about race at all. It's not a play about racism, and because Moor can refer to any sort of Muslim or person from a Muslim area, which includes the Arabian Peninsula, which includes, some Caucasian ethnicities. Some directors feel justified in casting white men in the role of Othello, and an example of that is actually the BBC production that's available for free in our links, in our library links. That BBC production, they cast Sir Anthony Hopkins as Othello. And that casting decision was made under the argument, the producers made the argument that it's not a play about racism. and that's how they justified that casting decision. However, I want to emphasize this. Most people definitely agree that Shakespeare meant an African man, that he meant a black man um, when he referred to Othello as being a Moor, and based on just, tons of textual evidence. And like we talked about last week, there really is just some good reasons for believing that when Shakespeare refers to skin as black, he does mean African black. Um, and so most people, especially throughout history, have cast Othello as a black man or have portrayed him as a black man. Um, so hold on, there's still some complications with accepting that Othello is a black man and casting him because um, historically there haven't been a lot of black actors to work with. In fact, the first black actor that I'm aware of that was cast in the role of Othello wasn't until the very early 1800s, I think the 1830s in London. There was a black actor that was cast as Othello, maybe the 1820s. Anyway, the vast majority of the time, from Shakespeare's day likely up through the mid 20th century, there was the, of course, unfortunate pattern of casting a white man and then using blackface. So this right here is a picture of the Laurence Olivier version of Othello, where Laurence Olivier played Othello. And oh my goodness, I can't remember the year. I think this was honestly like 1964, so fairly late, really. As you can see, Laurence Olivier is in full-on blackface makeup here. And historically, in Shakespeare's time, that is probably what happened as well. I've read a bunch of different arguments about how the portrayal might have worked on the original Elizabethan stage, and they may or may not have had makeup to make the skin look dark. They may have used cloth, actually, black cloth, just around the face and neck and arms to sort of hint or suggest black skin, sort of like a prosthetic black skin. So dyed black cloth would have been used because there is not any evidence that I'm aware of that there were any actual black actors in Shakespeare's day or in his company. So right, there is this long history of blackface. Of course, Shakespeare was working before the tradition of the minstrelry shows in early 20th or late 19th, early 20th century America, where blackface really was very problematic, and that is where most of the racial layers of blackface become super problematic. And so blackface today is definitely not definitely not acceptable in most castings of Othello. I'm not aware of a blackface casting of Othello that has happened in the past 50 years. I could be wrong. I could be wrong, but I'm not aware of one. So now, of course, the tradition is very much to cast just a black actor in the role of Othello. The first case actually in America, and I think this is sort of interesting, it was, it might be 1938, maybe 1948, was the first time on Broadway in New York where a black actor was cast with an all-white, with the rest of the cast being white. So there was a black Othello with a fuller white cast, and that was sort of revolutionary because remember, that was the era of Jim Crow laws and segregation, and so it was uncomfortable for American audiences at that time to see a mixed cast like that, to see a black actor working with white actors. Previous to that on the American stage, Othello had been acted by either entirely white casts with the blackface or entirely black casts, so the whole cast would be black. which is interesting. But of course now we do the mixed casting, usually with the Black Othello. So considering this history of casting, and how the text supports this idea of an actual African Black man as Othello, we think that Shakespeare very much was engaging in a discussion of racist themes. However, racism, just like everything else, right? Just like we talked about with madness and like we talked about with sexuality, racism also looked different in Shakespeare's day than it does today. So an example of that is going to be miscegenation, okay? And that is the marriage or the sexual coupling of a Black and a white person, or potentially any sort of racial mixing like that, but usually a Black and a white person having sexual relations or getting married. Today, miscegenation has a long and fraught history of anti-miscegenation laws in America, where it was actually illegal in America for centuries for a Black person and a white person to marry each other. And obviously that was tied up in slavery, that was tied up in many of the racial laws, post-slavery, Jim Crow type laws. Many states started doing away with those laws, especially after World War II. A lot of states started doing away with them, but it did take a Supreme Court ruling, if you're aware of Loving versus Virginia, in what year was that? 1967, I think. 1967, all the way until then, for a Supreme Court ruling to finally disband all anti-miscegenation laws in America. But 1967, guys, that is within living memory. There are people, a large portion of the population today that was alive back in a time in America when it was illegal for a Black person and a white person to marry. So this is recent history that we're talking about in America, and there is still a lot of baggage left over from that recent history, a lot of judgment and racism that comes into play when we're talking about marriage or relationships between Black people and white people. And to bring up a very recent in the news example of that, we can talk about the recent interview with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry by Oprah, where they talked about discussions with members of the royal family who were concerned that their child, Prince Archie, just Archie, would be too dark. His skin would be too dark. That is the worry about the offspring between Black and white couples. And that's recent. That's so recent, right? That these ideas are still percolating and still affecting these relationships. So couples today who are interracially married or coupled still face a lot of this social and cultural baggage of questioning if it's okay for Black people and white people to be involved this way. That's our current situation, way of viewing a relationship like this, like the one between Othello and Desdemona. Now, back in Shakespeare's day, they didn't necessarily have all that history and all that baggage. At the time, there weren't necessarily laws against these types of unions, right? So this is honestly just a little bit of uncharted territory for these people. They're just starting to experience the possibility with Europe having more and more contact with African nations and other types of peoples. These ideas are just beginning to be explored of what's okay, what types of relationships are okay between Europeans and these other cultures. And so while we see discomfort. We do, because we do. We absolutely see discomfort in this relationship. Okay, we get Iago trying to goad Desdemona's father, Brabantio, by saying, a black ewe is tupping your white, or no, a black ram is tupping your white ewe, right? That's inflammatory language, calling out the strangeness of this interracial union. And Brabantio is very upset by it, right? And uses a lot of language to express his disgust at the union between his daughter and Othello, and he does not want it to be allowed. So there's definitely some social discomfort with a black man marrying a white woman at this time. However, I have to say that the union is looked on fairly positively by many of the characters in this play. So Othello is actually a very respected member of this society. He is a general, it's a high-ranking military official. He is he's a Christian. Okay, so that's another complicating factor in calling him a Moor, because a Moor usually refers to a Muslim, but Othello is demonstrably Christian in this play, and he is very highly respected by the governors of Venice, by the council that governs Venice, and he's shown a lot of respect. And so his union with Desdemona, especially once the council decides that Desdemona willingly chose to marry Othello, the union is looked on positively. It's looked on positively by the leaders of Venice. It's looked on positively by most of Othello's subordinates, and most people outside of Iago and Brabantio don't really speak negatively about the implications of a black man marrying a white woman in this situation. Given that, it's interesting to see how this society is grappling with how to view Othello as an outsider. Because there is this story, right, where at first, even Brabantio, or Desdemona's father, respects Othello and is very intrigued by him and interested by him, and invites him into their home to speak to them and tell them the stories of his life. So, and I think they actually use the line, or Othello describes Brabantio as loving him. Brabantio did love me and did invite me in. So yes, Othello occupies this very interesting place in society, in this Venetian society, where he is an outsider, he is a foreigner, he is different, he is from a different place, but he is respected for his military prowess. He's found to be interesting for his history, his exciting history of, and I hope you caught this, Othello was actually a slave at one point. He was captured by an enemy and sold into slavery, and was eventually rescued from slavery, and has now risen all the way up to this level of general of the Venetian armies. So he does have this very interesting past, and so the Venetian people are sort of intrigued by Othello. They are fascinated by him, interested by him, and even Brabantio, remember, Desdemona's father, invites him into their home, right? And that's how Desdemona gets to know him. And she falls in love with him because of his exotic life story. She finds it so compelling and interesting and romantic and fascinating, right? So on the one hand, Othello's otherness is being met with openness and with respect, but right, there's definitely seeds, where there's definitely boundaries that they're trying to suss out of exactly how much Othello is going to be allowed into the society. So, Desdemona's father loves Othello enough to invite him into their home and to have him tell him these stories, but he does see it as crossing a boundary as soon as Othello marries into the family. So there's a line there for Brabantio where where Othello can serve them as a general and they can make use of his military prowess, but once he tries to join the family, that's too close. He's too different and too other to be allowed into the family. Of course, Desdemona doesn't see it that way, and many of the other Venetians don't necessarily see it that way. But you can see the seeds of that thought process there, where this feels dangerous to Brabantio. And Iago plays on that danger, on the seeds of that. This is an outsider. This is an otherness. This is a blackness. Do you want it tainting your whiteness? So the seeds are there, okay? Mixed in with the good respect. The seeds are sort of there, underlying this. So as we read through the rest of this play, I want you to pay attention to the ways that Othello's foreignness and his exoticness is consistently characterized by his skin color, by his blackness, and by stereotypes of African blacks. So while Othello may be a respected general, and while he may be allowed to marry into the Christian community at this time, we still, like I mentioned, very much see the seeds of the types of thinking and ideas about skin color and race that would eventually lead to racialized slavery and the history of racism that we have today. We see the seeds of it in this play. And so we are going to want to talk about this. What are these seeds of racism that we see? And how is this play commenting on racism, right? Is it sort of condoning it, or is it sort of upholding those stereotypes, upholding those boundaries of otherness, or is it breaking them down? Okay, it's a complicated question that we can continue to explore through the rest of this play. There's lots of other issues and themes here that we'll definitely want to talk about. Jealousy, the role of religion, the role of Christianity versus the otherness of the Muslim Turks. Domestic violence. Ooh, that's going to be a heavy one to deal with. So lots of other themes that we can talk about. But next week, the lecture is going to turn to focus on Iago, who is one of the most interesting villains. And I would say my personal, I find him the most evil of all of Shakespeare's villains. So next week, my lecture is going to focus on Iago, and I want you to be thinking about what are Iago's motivations? Why is he trying so hard to bring Othello down? What are those motivations? And why does he hate Othello so much? He does give some reasons, but we should talk about what those reasons are. And we should be thinking, how much does race have to do with it, right? How much is racism part of the whole tragedy of this play? All right, until next week.